You may have heard how you get there doesn't matter, and what people say when they're associating themselves with somebody that says that is that tactics and decision making aren't important. Now, I think that's a ridiculous assertion, which is basically the point of this video. Now, when you're entering into a structure, you could enter through a door or you could enter through a window. The reason that we typically choose to enter through doors is because it's the avenue of least resistance, and we can at least cover down inside the room somewhat as we're making entry into the room, which is something you really can't do when you're entering through a window. In the intro video, you saw Delta Force landing near an objective with helicopters, searching that objective, locating a hostage underneath a freezer, detaining a hostage taker, and I assume exfilling out of there. What we didn't see is Delta Force engaging enemy combatants, and therefore I don't think marksmanship was the most important thing that happened while they were on that objective. Now, I'm not saying marksmanship isn't important or isn't at the top of the list of importance, but I am saying that if you don't get there, your marksmanship ability won't matter anyways. What were the issues in the previous hostage rescue video that I covered? Officers hear 2 gunshots inside the room with the hostages. They go to make entry into the room. The officer working the door doesn't understand the condition of the door, or really, I guess, how to work doors. Doesn't understand that he actually has the door open enough to start pushing the door. The officer across from him doesn't apparently see that the door comes open, or at least doesn't communicate to the officer working the door that he has the door open, and therefore they resort to a failed attempt to breach the door. And that all looks like a how we get there problem. Now, when SWAT shows up 4 to 5 hours later and they decide to make entry into the room, what is the initial problem they're faced with? Well, they had a failed breach. The charges that they placed on the door did not detonate, it appears, and definitely didn't open the door as they expected it to. And that also looks like a how we get there problem. When they make entry into the room, an officer shoots a single round holding a shield at a hostage taker and eliminates the hostage. I'm almost certain that in their after action, one of the things that they brought up as something that they need to pay particular attention to and need to fix is a marksmanship problem. In law enforcement, we have a getting there problem. Not getting there at all is what gets officers killed. I'm not saying law enforcement doesn't have a marksmanship problem because 18 to 35% of the rounds they do fire even hit their target, but I am saying that this problem isn't what gets officers killed, and that's just a fact. There is an incident that I know about where an officer did a traffic stop. There was a suspect in the front seat and a suspect in the passenger seat. As the officer is talking to that person in the front seat, he can smell an odor of marijuana, so he lets the driver know that he can smell the odor of marijuana. The driver starts reaching towards the back seat area. The officer's telling him, hey, keep your hands up front, keep your hands up front. I believe the suspect actually tells the officer that he has a firearm back there, and then the officer decides to walk around the rear of the vehicle and open up the right rear passenger door, and when he does that, the suspect has a gun and shoots the officer. You see, the officer never got to marksmanship, so it doesn't really matter how good he was. His decision-making put him in a position where that was never a factor. And actually, what would have put the officer in a better position is what people don't like to talk about, which is the soft skills, the decision-making, the tactical aspects of how can we do things or not do things to put us in a position to win. So, for example, if you make a traffic stop and you're in that position, you smell an odor of marijuana, you know you're going to go through the vehicle, you know there's two suspects in there, and even if there was only a driver, you know you're not going to do that by yourself, hopefully, if you don't have to. And so why even tell the suspect that you can smell the odor of marijuana? In that situation, just act like everything's okay. Hey, I'm going to just check your driver's license real quick. Let me go back to my car, and in the meantime, you're calling for backup. Now, when your backup gets there, at worst, you and your partner or your backup can walk up to that car together. It's extremely unlikely he'll be able to shoot both of you if he decides to do that. And at best, you could just stay back at your car and call the suspect out from there. Now, if he was planning on shooting you, there's a good chance he's probably just going to take off, then it'll turn into vehicle pursuit, and then we can just handle it that way. No matter where you look, either in law enforcement or military operations, you find within the after action problems not associated with marksmanship. Take Operation Red Wings, for example. What those SEALs did was, over a period of days, make several false inserts in the area before actually inserting in an effort to confuse the Taliban, essentially. And what that actually did was alert the Taliban that something was probably going to be happening. And so the SEALs fast roped in, they left their fast rope there, and from the moment they were dropped in, they were essentially being tracked by the Taliban. What was actually supposed to happen is the Marine Scout snipers who were supposed to run that mission were going to be inserted away from the objective and then take several days to get there. And so in both those scenarios, how they actually got there and how they were supposed to get there was the determining factor and the significant determining factor and likely why those Navy SEALs, the 3 Navy SEALs that were killed, and the additional 16 that were arriving in the Quick Reaction Force, or the 16 military personnel that were arriving as the Quick Reaction Force, were ultimately killed. And so, like I said, in the military and in law enforcement, how you get there is really important. In this video, LAPD is arriving on a domestic call or a call for help, and they identify the residence in which this problem is occurring.
I need help, please! Please, I need help! I need help! I need help!
It's the police! Police!
There's a kid.
Go! Hey! He has a rifle! He has a rifle! Go! Hey! Rifle!
You might watch that video and say, well, look, how they got there didn't really matter. And I would agree with you. In hindsight, it didn't really matter. It doesn't appear that they checked their corner, and I don't know why you would, because you're entering into a space you haven't been in, you haven't seen. If you're going to move from point A to point B, you're not losing anything by actually checking that hard corner to the right. But they did, indeed, from what I can tell, or what it appears, move from the threshold straight to the hallway without actually deliberately checking the hard corner. Maybe they had more information, maybe they could see more than we can see from their body cameras. But in that instance, how they got there didn't really matter. But you don't look at it in hindsight like, well, it didn't actually matter. You look at it, could it have mattered? And the answer is absolutely it could have. Most officers are killed with their gun in their holster before they fire a round. And when I say before they fire a round, I'm talking about officers get killed when they actually have their gun out. And what did you also notice about this incident? Well, back to what I said earlier. The officers shot about 5 rounds each, and they hit the suspect 1 time in the leg. So they shot amongst the both of them 10% below the national average, and still no law enforcement officers were killed and no hostages were injured. And so although their marksmanship performance was very poor, it did not affect the outcome of the situation. In fact, I would argue there was a positive outcome outside of the fact that they shot a lot of rounds and missed. And what I also see people trying to do, which I think is really absurd, is they'll point to those incidents where officers died with their gun in their holster or before they fire a round and still say that's a marksmanship problem, that's a competency problem with your firearm. Well, does it sound like in the story that I told you about that officer who saw the suspect digging for a gun and then went around to the other side of the car and opened up the door? Does that sound like the officer gave himself a chance, and if the officer would have been faster to the draw, he would have been successful in that situation? No, the officer placed himself in an ambush, one that he didn't have to actually be in. I've even heard people assign this methodology to events like Uvalde. They say Uvalde was a marksmanship problem, Uvalde was a competency with firearms problem, and Uvalde spanned a time of an hour and 11 minutes in total. Bortak arrived at about 12:13, 12:15, and it wasn't for another 35 minutes at 12:50 where the room was actually assaulted and the active shooter was taken out, which, by the way, was likely not done by operators from Bortak. In the front of the stack, you have a guy in khaki shorts, and then behind him, I think you have a guy in khaki pants, and then you have some Bortak-looking individuals behind him. Alert even says that there's no reason that they can understand as to why they decided to assault the room at 12:50 versus any time earlier, because nothing had changed. So it's not like somehow at some point at 12:50 somebody was all of a sudden had the ability, the marksmanship ability and the confidence in their marksmanship abilities to take the room, and that's why they did it. That makes no sense, okay? Uvalde, if you had to just categorize it into one big problem, it was a decision-making problem. It was, we're taking way too long to try to figure out how we get there problem. If you think it's ridiculous to think how you get there doesn't matter, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel already, and don't forget to feed the algorithm down below.